If you often feel sad, anxious, or mentally exhausted, if your mind keeps racing at night and peace feels out of reach, then this video is made for you. In it, you'll learn powerful strategies to take control of your depression and anxiety, not by avoiding them, but by understanding and mastering them. You'll discover how solitude can be your strength and how emotional pain can be turned into power. Watch till the end, because the solutions you've been searching for might begin right here. A man in despair is no different from a dethroned prince. He once held dominion over his thoughts, his actions, his ambitions. Now, the throne is vacant, and in its place sit uninvited governors: fear, sorrow, and inertia. Depression, at its core, is not a matter of sadness. It is a collapse of sovereignty. It is when a man's will no longer commands his faculties, and his mind becomes foreign terrain ruled by weakness. To regain control, one must first recognize that the path to healing does not lie in pleading for mercy from the world, nor in expecting others to rescue him. No external army can reclaim the fortress of the mind. Only the exiled king himself can return and seize it. This is not an act of emotion. It is an act of war. When a ruler is overthrown, it is often because he grew complacent. He trusted his comforts, he neglected his discipline, and he allowed lesser voices to dictate policy. The mind behaves no differently. Depression often grows in silence, but it begins with small acts of surrender: the decision to sleep instead of rise, to delay instead of act, to speak self-pity instead of command. These acts seem insignificant when committed in isolation, but over time, they accumulate like a conspiracy until the entire palace is compromised. A man wakes up one day to find himself a prisoner in his own skull, surrounded by familiar shadows that now dictate his every move. This happens not because he is cursed or fragile, but because he allowed his will to decay. There is a false doctrine in the modern world that says the cure for suffering is gentleness. It tells a man to seek understanding before action, comfort before conquest. But this is the language of weakness disguised as care. No prince ever regained his kingdom by asking his captors to be kind. The mind respects force. The spirit responds to command. If you wait to feel ready, if you wait for your sadness to subside, you will never move. It is not the removal of pain that restores power. It is action taken in spite of pain. A man must rise while he still aches. He must act while his bones still tremble. In this, the will reasserts itself. The throne is reclaimed not with ceremony, but with daily war. He must audit his life with brutal clarity. Where has he surrendered? What indulgences has he allowed to rot his character? Who are the parasites he calls friends? What distractions dull his edge? These are not questions for a therapist. These are questions for a general planning the retaking of his capital. Discipline is not a cure, it is a sword. Waking early, avoiding comfort, rejecting laziness, these are not lifestyle choices, they are military tactics. Every man who feels crushed under depression must remember, he is not sick, he is outnumbered. And in war, the goal is not to feel better, it is to win. To defeat the enemy within, one must cease speaking its language. The internal monologue of the depressed is soft, emotional, uncertain. It must be silenced and replaced with commands. Not suggestions, not motivations, commands. Get up, work, clean, write. These are not small tasks. These are acts of rebellion against the occupying force. Each completed task is a banner raised on retaken territory. Each hour reclaimed from darkness is a fortress recaptured. There is no space for negotiation with depression. There is only conquest or surrender, and if a man will not rule himself, something else always will. Anxiety is the mind's betrayal of its own strength, a fevered whisper that undermines the confidence of even the most capable soul. It is not rooted in weakness, but in misdirected energy, like a general who commands all the troops to march but never chooses a battlefield. A man suffering from anxiety is not lacking power, rather, he is overwhelmed by possibilities, trapped in a loop of imagining consequences instead of directing outcomes. This condition is not solved by soft encouragement or passive acceptance, but by the cultivation of inner order, a strategic discipline over thought, time, and focus. A ruler whose court is filled with constant murmuring cannot lead effectively. The same is true of the anxious mind. The noise must be silenced by force, not by permission. Anxiety thrives in the absence of clear priorities. It festers in men who do not command their time, who allow each hour to be occupied by unfiltered demands, doubts, and distractions. These men do not live, they are lived by circumstance. Just as a principality left without structure invites rebellion, the mind without hierarchy invites chaos. One must erect a strict architecture for living. Every hour must serve a purpose, every thought must be weighed for its utility. There can be no tolerance for idle speculation, no hospitality for what-ifs and imagined disasters. The anxious man must become a tyrant over his own imagination, lest it become his executioner. There is a hidden truth rarely admitted. Anxiety often masks a desire for control over that which cannot be controlled. It is a subtle arrogance, a belief that by worrying more, by anticipating every variable, one can shield oneself from pain, from embarrassment, from loss. But this is a lie. The prince who seeks to control the weather wastes his court's attention. A wise ruler distinguishes between that which he commands and that which he must endure. The anxious man must divide the world into two realms: what is his to govern, and what must be left to fate. Once this boundary is clear, his power consolidates. He wastes no energy chasing winds, and he begins to master what is his. To achieve this mental sovereignty, a man must submit to ritual. Not as superstition, but as a system of stability. Rituals in sleep, in diet, in speech, in physical labor. These are not luxuries, they are armors. The more predictable a man's environment becomes, the less room there is for chaos to enter. Anxious men are often victims of inconsistency. They live at the mercy of how they feel, and thus their days are ruled by chance. But a man who repeats his victories daily, who builds unshakable routines, renders his internal world less susceptible to panic. He moves like a monarch in a stable kingdom, confident, measured, unaffected by every loud voice outside the palace gates. Equally vital is the control of information. The modern world floods the mind with news, opinions, and noise. The anxious man absorbs it all and wonders why he trembles. Would a ruler allow spies and enemies to speak freely in his court, day and night? No, he would exile them. A man must guard his mind with the same ferocity. He must eliminate the sources of constant agitation, the newsfeeds, the gossip, the senseless noise. In silence, he can hear his true counsel again. In stillness, he regains the voice that leads. Lastly, one must not shy away from fear, but use it. The anxious mind is already practiced at imagining the worst. Instead of resisting it, a man must turn this power into preparation. Let fear become foresight. Let it guide action, not paralysis. Just as a cunning ruler anticipates betrayal and prepares accordingly, a man can acknowledge his anxieties and use them to create strategies, not in endless circles of thought, but in direct acts of power. In this transformation, anxiety is no longer an enemy. It becomes a tool. It is not banished but broken and reshaped to serve. Depression is not merely the absence of joy, it is the erosion of authority within oneself. It is the moment a man ceases to command his own will and instead becomes subject to the silent rebellion of his inner court. Just as a ruler whose advisors grow mute and his soldiers weary finds his throne in danger, so too does the man whose spirit refuses to rise. But this state is not incurable. It requires not softness, but strategy, not comfort, but command. The melancholic soul must be ruled, just as a faltering state must be brought back to discipline, order, and purpose. To lift oneself from depression is not to wait for light to return, but to draw the sword in the dark and strike until the sun rises. Depression thrives where there is no duty. The idle man is most vulnerable to despair, for his mind turns inward like a snake that devours itself. Inactivity is the breeding ground for melancholy. As a field left untended is soon overrun with weeds. Therefore, a man must not wait to feel capable. He must impose labor upon himself before his feelings are ready to obey. A prince does not rebuild his city when he is inspired, he rebuilds because it must be done. The act creates the strength. In the same way, a man burdened by sorrow must create an architecture of duty that permits no delay. If his hands tremble, let them tremble while they work. If his thoughts are heavy, let them weigh down action, not prevent it. This inner reformation begins with the body, for it is the foundation of the spirit's fortress. A neglected body becomes a doorway through which despair marches in unchallenged. Physical rigor is not vanity, it is a tactic. The man who disciplines his body reclaims authority over himself. It is no different than a prince enforcing military drills in a demoralized army. Sweat is the ceremony of defiance against the pull of nothingness. Cold water, fast walking, hard breath, these are not cures, they are campaigns. Each action, however small, is a flag raised in rebellion against decay. The depressed man who moves despite himself is already more powerful than the joyful man who moves only when he feels like it. Moreover, a man in despair must be reminded that isolation is the echo chamber of hopelessness. Though solitude is a virtue for reflection, prolonged detachment becomes poison. A wise ruler does not allow his generals to conspire in the dark, he calls them to counsel. In the same way, a suffering soul must be brought into relation, not to plead for sympathy, but to re-enter the realm of influence. Relationships are not merely emotional, they are strategic alliances against the siege of the mind. One must choose these alliances carefully. Seek not those who coddle, but those who challenge. Speak not to be pitied, but to be reawakened. The mind itself must be brought to heel, and this is done through writing, reading, and ruthless examination. Thoughts left unexpressed multiply like vermin in a cellar. When a man writes, he chains his demons to the page. When he reads, he invites older minds to speak where silence has been. But he must not read passively. He must interrogate every sentence, extract its value, and discard the rest. Just as a strategist learns from maps and histories, so too must the depressed man study the terrain of his own suffering. He must learn what triggers his decay, and he must then deny it quarter in his life. Lastly, he must refuse to believe the lie that his current state defines his entire self. Depression clouds the memory of one's past victories and distorts the view of future potential. It is a trick of the inner enemy, and like all enemies, it must be countered with intelligence and action. The man must review every conquest he has ever achieved, no matter how small, and build them into a history that defends him. Let him speak aloud his own accomplishments, write them, remember them with military precision. This is not arrogance, it is defense. When the walls of the spirit crumble, one rebuilds with whatever stones remain. Pride in one's survival is not a sin, it is the first brick of resurrection. Anxiety is a creature born of uncertainty, and like all things that inspire fear in man, it thrives in the absence of control. The anxious mind is a kingdom in which whispers of the future carry more weight than the facts of the present. It is not external events that undo a man, but the mind's interpretation of them, its exaggerations, its phantom predictions, its incessant rehearsal of ruin. To cope with anxiety, one must not appeal to comfort or peace, but rather to structure and power. The anxious man does not need calm, he needs clarity. And clarity comes not by waiting for serenity to appear, but by commanding the mind to obey a higher principal order. A wise ruler does not fear the rumors of war. He calls his generals, consults his maps, sharpens his weapons, and prepares. Similarly, when anxiety knocks, the man must not flee to distraction or indulgence. He must engage with it as a sovereign engages with a threat to his rule, not emotionally, but tactically. Anxiety is a signal, not a sentence. It is the messenger, not the enemy. The danger lies in surrendering to it without investigation. What is feared? Is it real? Is it immediate? Can it be acted upon? The man must dissect his anxiety until it no longer holds mystique. Just as fear of the dark disappears when the candle is lit, so too does fear lose its power when exposed to scrutiny. But understanding alone is not enough. The anxious mind requires discipline, as the body does. A mind left untrained will wander toward terror, just as a child left unattended will approach fire. Therefore, ritual must be employed. The man must structure his day like a fortress, every hour accounted for, every task defined. When time is vague, worry enters. When purpose is absent, dread finds its home. Anxiety flourishes in chaos, so one must impose form. This is not to say life becomes rigid, but that the mind becomes occupied. A mind engaged in creation, in construction, in pursuit, such a mind has no space for imaginary collapse. Movement is the antidote to paralysis. There is also a hidden arrogance in unchecked anxiety. It assumes that one's anticipation of disaster is somehow accurate, that one's vision of the future is more precise than reality will permit. The man must humble himself. He must accept that he does not know what tomorrow brings, and in this ignorance, he must find strength. For just as a ruler cannot control the winds or tides, neither can a man control the totality of fate. But he can prepare. He can make himself robust. He can build systems of thought that do not crumble under the weight of uncertainty. This is not nav-vidate, it is strategy. The oak does not resist the storm by predicting its path, it survives by having roots. Furthermore, the anxious mind must be reminded of its own history. How many fears in the past have come true? How many sleepless nights were followed by ordinary days? The man must keep a record, not of his fears, but of his victories over them. Each time he faced what he dreaded and endured it, that is a triumph worthy of remembrance. Just as nations inscribe battles on monuments to shape national memory, the individual must record and revisit his own psychological conquests. This creates a mental defense against future panic. It is proof that he has survived before and he will again. Lastly, he must be ruthless in eliminating the sources of false urgency. The modern world is a factory of anxiety, fueled by noise, distraction, and artificial crisis. The man must curate his influences as a king chooses his counsel. Not every voice deserves to be heard. Not every headline merits reaction. He must learn the value of silence, not as escape but as power. A man who can sit still, think clearly, and act only when necessary is a man who cannot be ruled by fear. Anxiety will always whisper, but it need not command. And when it does arrive, let it find in you not a trembling subject, but a ruler prepared. Depression is not merely the absence of joy, it is a rebellion of the self against itself, a silent insurrection in which the will refuses to obey its master. It creeps slowly, not with noise or fanfare, but like a shadow growing larger as the light fades. And the most dangerous thing about it is that it convinces the man it inhabits that action is futile, that resistance is absurd, that the weight cannot be lifted. But in this illusion lies the key. Depression must be confronted not as a disease to be pitied, but as an adversary to be outmaneuvered. The first step to coping with it is to strip it of its mask of inevitability and expose it as a pattern, a trap, a mental architecture that can be torn down. One must understand the mechanics of this condition as one would study the anatomy of a castle to invade it. Depression isolates. It whispers that no one understands, that no one cares, and that the self is alone in a world too cold to notice. This illusion of solitude is its strongest weapon. Therefore, it must be met with deliberate contradiction. The man must resist the temptation to retreat inward. He must, like a prince outnumbered on the battlefield, send for his allies. To speak is to shatter the silence that depression feeds on. But he must choose his audience wisely, not those who pacify with empty comfort, but those who speak truth, who challenge his apathy, who offer structure, not sympathy. Yet he must not depend entirely on others. A sovereign who relies too heavily on his ministers risks being overthrown. The depressed man must become both the ruler and the soldier within his own mind. He must establish routines, not because he feels like it, but because depression is allergic to order. Even the smallest act, made bed, a walk in the sun, a task completed, becomes a declaration of war. These actions may seem trivial, but in the eyes of depression, they are acts of defiance. Discipline, not motivation, must become the foundation. The will may not want to act, but the man must act anyway, trusting that obedience will lead to strength even when desire is absent. Depression also distorts time. It stretches hours into eternities and collapses days into blurs. Therefore, the man must regain control of his temporal perception. He must divide his day into segments and rule each one as a separate dominion. Morning must be conquered with intention, afternoon with production, evening with reflection. The night, often depression's strongest ally, must be managed with ritual and finality. Late hours filled with thought and darkness are where the enemy plants its seeds. One must retire with purpose, as a general withdrawing to regroup, not as a fugitive escaping defeat. It is also essential to examine the source of the mind's despair. Often depression feeds on unlived potential, on ambitions buried or ignored. The man must ask himself, what fire has been extinguished in him? What dream did he once carry like a sword, now rusted and hidden? Sometimes, to escape depression, one must resurrect a former self, a self who dared, who desired, who believed in his own capacity. Purpose is the greatest antidote, not happiness, not comfort, purpose. The man who wakes each day with a reason to rise is the man least likely to fall. Even if that purpose is not grand, it must be cultivated like a field, with care, with labor, with repetition. Finally, the man must accept that this struggle may not end with a single victory. Depression, like any insurgency, retreats and returns. But the wise ruler builds defenses. He does not grow lax in times of peace. He continues the practices that brought him out of darkness: structure, purpose, discipline, and dialogue. He does not expect to feel better overnight. He expects only to fight each day with strategy, not emotion. The man who treats his own mind as a kingdom to govern, not a burden to endure, is the man who will eventually find peace. not given, but seized. In a world where the mind often becomes its own battleground, where anxiety and depression wage silent wars from within, the man who chooses to confront rather than collapse is already on the path to victory. The struggle is not won through sentiment, nor by indulging weakness, but by constructing an inner citadel fortified with clarity, purpose, and unyielding discipline. To cope is not to cower, it is to rule. The wise man does not wait for relief, he creates it, piece by piece, by mastering his routines, by confronting his thoughts as one would interrogate a traitor, and by turning solitude into strategy, not sorrow. The world offers no guarantee of happiness, but it does offer the chance for control over oneself, over one's habits, over one's mental terrain. This is the lesson for those besieged by the storms of despair. Do not wait for calm skies. Build a ship that can sail through chaos. Govern your thoughts as you would a state, through law, through vigilance, through ruthless prioritization of what strengthens over what soothes. In this lies your freedom, not in escape, but in command, not in the search for comfort, but in the pursuit of power over your own mind.